Hey there. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Total Ramblings. In this episode, we are looking at episode 11, series 2 of Andor, the penultimate ever episode of Andor. Really glad this series exists, but getting quite sad that I've only got one episode to go. This episode is entitled Who Else Knows? And warning, there are going to be some massive Death Star sized spoilers here in this episode. So if you don't want to know what happens in this episode, and or if you just haven't seen it, maybe come back and watch me afterwards. So we open up, we are in the action immediately after the end of the last episode, and we are focusing on a dead stormtrooper in the hospital grounds. And Supervisor Hirt of the ISB is investigating the hospital attack, and they he's talking with his underling, and they basically say, well, their current theory is that there were three of them, that team of three that have attacked because, you know, this attack was swift, it was professional, there were distractions, blah blah blah. And Hirt is of course very keen to say, don't forget, this was Dedra Meero's security operation, and this is all on her. Basically, he's trying to set her up for a fall. We cut to Dedra Meero, and she is in an interrogation room with Director Krennic outside. I was a little bit surprised that Dedra Meero still had her code cylinders, because you thought they would have been removed immediately, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Anyway, he enters the room, and he is extremely pissed off, shall we say. And his first question is, who else knows? And she's like, well, as far all I know is that Supervisor Young's been assassinated. He's been murdered. And he's like, really? I'm not really here for this. What single thing would drag me to this forsaken basement? And Dedra says the words, Death Star. And she's not supposed to know this word, Death Star. And basically, she knows a lot more than she's supposed to know. And Krennic says, who else knows? Because this is like beyond top secret, this entire project. Anyway, it's funny to see that Dedra is trying to drop Supervisor Hirt in it, because, you know, there's no love lost between them, those two. And basically, she says, it's revealed that Supervisor Young spent 3 hours going through her records, and she says, well, you know, if he's got my clearances, he's stolen them. Whereas, of course, from Director Krennic's perspective, you know, she's looking very much like a rebel, like part of the rebellion. She basically reveals that she has had information sent to her by accident. And something I didn't mention in the last episode, I was wondering if Young was using her access to kind of set her up. And if he's done that, then he's done a very good job, because basically she's under suspicion now because she knows things she shouldn't know. She complains to Krennic that she's only ever been looking for access. She's had to scavenge for information because heavy-handed tactics from other people have resulted in dead suspects. And, you know, she's had to kind of scrounge around for the information. And she says, she recommends to Krennic that you need to cover all the transit points to stop Luthen's assistant, Claire, from escaping. And he's quite brutal with her. He says, we'll do our best to carry on without you. And then we cut to a scene where a very nervous hospital security man is being interviewed by Supervisor Hirt and the ISB. And having gone through the camera footage, they realise there is no team. There was no team of three people. It's Claire. It's one person. Meanwhile, she's at the safe house opening a hole in the wall and assembling some equipment, which we assume is some kind of radio communications equipment, and indeed it is. And she starts sending a sort of coded Morse type message, which is picked up by our friend Wilmon on Yavin. And Wilmon takes this information to Andor, his friend Melshi, who we saw in Series 1 and who we will see later in Rogue One, and K2SO, where they're all playing games together. And nice to see a little bit of humour in this show with K2SO being his usual sassy self, answering back, speaking really as not many droids have ever spoken before. Krennic, Major Partagaz and Hirt are discussing this situation with Kleya, and Krennic basically says there is no horizon to the limits of finding Kleya, because basically he knows that anything that Luthen knew will now be known by Kleya, and that means she knows about the Death Star, and she is possibly the only non-Imperial who now knows about the Death Star. So basically they've got to hunt her down. And they decide to put out some kind of cover story that she's diseased, that she escaped from the hospital without authorization, and she's going to infect anyone she comes into contact with, and, could cause the deaths of millions. And they send Supervisor Hirt out of the room, and then Partagaz reveals that he knows about the Death Star, and basically they have a little argument. He says to Krennic, you were supposed to have this thing ready by now, and Krennic's kind of like, yeah, it's days away from being active. And Partagaz is saying it's a miracle we've managed to keep it quiet for this long. Presumably the ISB has been keeping a lid on any information leaking about the Death Star for some years now. But it's clear that with Dedra Meero's imprisonment and the fact that the ISB ultimately were the ones that have allowed this information to leak by sort of confronting Luthen in the way that they have, basically the ISB is massively fucked up here. And basically, I think everybody in the ISB is their necks on the block, essentially. Kleya, meanwhile, is sending regular signals, and Cassian wants to go and extract her. And in a typical Cassian and K2SO and Melshi way, they board a U-wing and they get the heck out of there against orders. There's a lovely line from K2SO, and he's saying, do you know how many orders we've disobeyed so far? Cassian says, I'm not interested. He says 17. And then they promptly switch off the communications, and then K2SO says 18 now. Anyway, Supervisor Hirt, meanwhile, visits Dedra in prison, and now she has had her rank and her code cylinders removed, so no chance of her getting out. Basically, he reveals to her that Luthen is dead, and, they have a little bit of a confrontation because, like I said, no love lost there. And Dedra says to Hirt, I'm sure there's an open cell for you down here. He basically says, look, I'm after a lead for tracking down his assistant. And she says, well, we found some radio equipment before. You should be looking for old, outdated radio pulse frequencies. So that's kind of what they do. They go back to the equipment at the shop, which, although largely destroyed, the transmitter is still kind of working because it's plugged into an Imperial terminal. And eventually they do pick up the signals from Kleya. General Draven back on Yavin is extremely annoyed, asking where Andor's gone, and he basically implies to Wilmon that, Luthen clicks his fingers and off you go running. And Wilmon says, you need to bear in mind that none of this would be here without Luthen. In other words, you owe him a great debt. We kind of then cut back to the U-wing, which now comes out of hyperspace into orbit around Coruscant. Melshi's never been before. K2SO says, I've been to Coruscant. He says, there were 200 of us KX units in a parade and the Emperor was there. It was quite funny. He seems quite proud of that fact. Anyway, as I say, the ISB, meanwhile, are picking up the signal. And so Andor arrives on Coruscant and directs K2SO as to where to land because they're heading for the safe house that he used to live in. And at the same time, we see an ISB shuttle leaving with a TAC team on board. My kind of thought was, why aren't they sending stormtroopers or Navy troopers or Army troopers? But of course, this is an ISB fuck up, right? So I'm guessing they still want to cover themselves and they don't want another agency to bail them out. So it's kind of kept as an ISB internal issue at the moment. the ISB arrive at the location where the safe house is and immediately scramble the comms, which cuts off Cassian from being able to talk to K2SO on board the U-Wing. And then Andor makes his way to the door of the safe house, and Kleya lets him in, very relieved to see him, but it's clear that she wants to stay and he wants to get her off the planet back to Yavin. And anyway, she basically info dumps all the information that she knows about Jeddah, Gorman, Kyber crystals, Galen Erso, etc., etc. And basically, she also kind of says to Andor that, you know, you told us you were done at one point, and you've kind of left us here. In other words, you've left Luthen and me here, and Andor knows now that Luthen is dead. And again, you know, Kleya is kind of saying, you owe Luthen so much because he stayed here, and because he stayed here, he's got this information. We now know about this super weapon. I don't think they know what it's called yet, but they know that there's a super weapon being built. Meanwhile, the TAC team are moving in on the apartment. First of all, they get the wrong door because their equipment isn't quite focusing correctly. And one of them says, did we request an enforcement droid as backup? And they kind of say, no, it must be a local patrol. And you see K2SO, who now can't talk to Andor through the radio. He's walking towards one of the troopers, one of the TAC troopers. And the guy says, are you with us? And there's a brief pause as K2SO goes close. He just says, no, and then swipes the guy off the balcony. Absolutely fantastic. K2SO then boards the TAC team shuttle and apparently kills the guys that are left on board. And then we kind of end the episode with the TAC team now moving in on the safe house and presumably imminently about to breach it. So, yeah, another fantastic episode. I'm in two minds about this, right? I can't wait for the next one, which I'm about to watch in a minute. And also I'm very sad that it's going to be the last one. This is the best Star Wars ever since Rogue One. These people just get it, right? This is Star Wars as a war, as, you know, this is kind of like Game of Thrones in space, but million times better, you know? And it seems that everybody at the end of this is, you know, in fear for their lives, basically, including the ISB. And Dedra Meero, so I said in the last episode, would that be the last we see of her? No, but now she's in prison. So where has all this ambition and hatred got her? Her desire to capture Axis has basically got her locked up in the brig as a suspected rebel spy. The word of the Death Star is now out. They just have to get it back to the rebels. And this is, of course, all leading up to Rogue One and the Battle of Yavin, where the Death Star, having spent 20 years being built, will, spoiler warning, be destroyed. So, yeah, I can't recommend this enough. It's absolutely fascinating to see life on Coruscant, to see the ISB, another branch of the Imperials with their own sort of troopers and their own kind of uniforms and their own kind of TAC teams and shuttles and vehicles and what have you. I just love all of this stuff. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm going to dive straight in and watch episode 12 now because I can't go on the internet in case I get spoiled. These episodes dropped at about 2 o'clock this morning UK time, and it's nearly 7:15 in the evening. So I've been working today, and as soon as I could finish work, I started watching these because I can't go online until I've seen them. There you go. So anyway, I'd like to thank you very much for joining me for this episode of Total Ramblings, and I will see you for the next episode, in which I will be looking at episode 12 of Andor. See you in a minute, maybe.